The snow began falling 3 days earlier, but by the time the wind turned, nobody was laughing anymore. Before the whiteout swallowed the ridgeline, before horses went still under their blankets, and men's breath froze on their beards in solid arcs, there had been jokes about the dirt-covered fool who'd vanished into the hillside back in October, about how he probably froze to death already in that hole he called a shelter, about how someone ought to dig him out come spring just to make sure he hadn't grown roots like a hibernating bear. But the jokes stopped when the storm didn't, and by then there was only one place left where the fire still burned, where water still ran in a thawed bucket, and where a man could breathe without his lungs screaming from the cold, the cave. But to understand how it came to that, how an outcast loner's crude earth shelter became the last refuge in the worst blizzard to strike the high plains in 2 decades, you'd have to go back to the fall, not far, just back to September of 1840, near the edges of the Laramie Range, in what was not yet Wyoming territory. A string of early frosts had already stunted the last of the prairie grass. Game was thinning, the trap lines along the creeks ran slow, and a small trapping outfit, led by a seasoned frontiersman named Elias Bowman, was making its way down toward the lower elevation crossings where winter wouldn't hit quite so hard. Elias was hard to miss, tall, wide in the shoulders, with a long grey beard that split at the chin like a buffalo's tail, and a voice that could carry across an entire valley. He'd been trapping beaver and running furs out of the Rockies since Andrew Jackson was president. Men followed him because he was right more often than not, and when he wasn't, he was still lucky enough to pull everyone through. This season, he'd picked up 2 new hands at Fort Laramie, young, eager types with decent gear and no clue what they were in for. But it was the third man who joined that set-off quiet talk, Thomas Zachary, a broad-shouldered, dirt-streaked, sunburned settler who said little, carried no traps, and didn't seem to be hunting beaver at all. He'd shown up at the fort with a mule, 2 shovels, a handsaw, a sack of dried beans, and a homemade tool that looked like something between a pickaxe and a pry bar. Most assumed he was headed east, back toward farming country. But when Elias mentioned he was taking a group south through the mountains to overwinter near the Box Elder Basin, Thomas asked to travel with them for a while. Elias, to everyone's surprise, agreed. If he pulls his weight and keeps quiet, he's welcome, was all he said. They rode together 3 weeks, through terrain that would have turned back most freight wagons. The others built lean-tos in the evenings and cooked over open fires. Thomas, by contrast, slept apart, dug shallow pits, and seemed constantly preoccupied with the ground beneath his feet. More than once, someone caught him measuring slopes with a plumb line or thumping the soil with a rod. One night around the fire, after a bottle of corn liquor had made the rounds, someone finally asked, "You looking for gold under there, Thomas?" He didn't smile, just looked toward the mountains and said, "I'm building something." That was the end of it. No further explanation came. But as they reached the basin and the group began picking spots for winter camps, most close to timberlines and water, Thomas turned his mule and headed uphill toward a wind-battered bluff that overlooked the entire valley. Elias called after him, "You sure you want to be up there come winter? No cover, no wood? That dirt won't keep you warm." Thomas turned in his saddle. "That's the point," he said, and kept riding. That was the last anyone saw of him for months. He didn't come down to trade or hunt. His fires weren't visible. Most assumed he'd moved on or frozen to death in the first cold snap until the storm hit. But the work Thomas did on that bluff in those 6 weeks before the snow began was not the work of a madman. It was the work of someone who had once frozen half to death and swore it would never happen again. The others didn't know his history, but Thomas had spent the previous winter in a half-collapsed cabin near the South Platte River, surviving on squirrel meat and melting snow, wrapped in a buffalo hide that grew mold from the damp. He'd watched 2 men die that season, one from exposure, one from infection after a toe went black and came off in a boot. He'd come out of that winter changed, not angry, not even bitter, just focused. And he'd begun to think about heat not as something to chase, but something to trap. His cave wasn't really a cave, not at first. It started as a dugout. He found a slope facing slightly southeast, sheltered from prevailing winds, with enough clay in the soil to hold shape but enough sand to drain. He marked out a space 10 feet wide by 12 feet deep and began digging. He used the slope to his advantage, cutting straight into the hillside so that the roof would eventually be level with the ground. The earth itself would become 3 sides and the ceiling. Only the front face would need building up. Every day, Thomas labored from dawn until dark. The mule hauled dirt in canvas sacks. He shaped the walls with a scraping tool, smoothing them to minimize collapse risk. He dug a shallow trench across the floor and lined it with flat stones, his cold trap to catch and sink the densest air. He lined the walls with slabs of sod and compacted dirt to prevent dripping. Then came the front wall, made of logs stacked horizontally and sealed with a mix of pine pitch, moss, and clay. The door was cut from scavenged planks, double-layered with fir scraps sandwiched in between. For a chimney, he ran clay-lined stovepipe through a raised vent that doubled back and trapped heat before The smoke escaped. No heat would be lost unless Thomas allowed it. His fire pit sat slightly off-center, built low to the ground, ringed in stones he carried up from the creek bed. But the real magic came from the ceiling. Before closing the roof, Thomas laid a lattice of thick poles, topped it with hides, then packed 2 feet of dry earth on top. The entire shelter became a womb of thermal mass. Once warmed, it held heat. Once sealed, it stayed sealed. No wind, no drafts. No light, either, unless Thomas uncovered the tiny vent hole in the upper wall. To those below, in their tents and thrown-together cabins, it seemed like Thomas had disappeared. But by November, as frost covered every branch and the night howls began to echo closer than they should, he was alive and warm inside that shelter, eating hot stew and watching his breath not rise but stay still. The storm came early, even by mountain standards. A wall of white swept in overnight, riding winds that sounded like ghosts screaming through the timber. The snow didn't fall straight, it hurled sideways. Temperatures dropped 30 degrees in 12 hours. One man tried to chop firewood and collapsed. Another's cabin caught an ember and burned. Water froze in buckets indoors. Horses panicked, broke loose, ran blind into the white, and still it snowed. When the second day brought no reprieve, Elias sent 2 men up to scout Thomas's bluff, not out of hope, but desperation. They returned hours later, red-faced and trembling, but alive. "He's up there," one of them said. "He's got fire, water. It's warm," the others stared, then packed what they could and trudged through waist-high snow, dragging sleds, carrying wounded, cradling frost-bitten hands and feet. The climb nearly killed 3 of them. But when they reached the bluff, Thomas was waiting. He'd cleared the front of the shelter. The door opened. Warmth poured out like breath. No one laughed, no one spoke. One by one, they ducked inside. And that was when the real story began. There was no ceremony when they entered the shelter. No words passed between Thomas and the first man through the door. It was the silence that stunned them most, not the absence of sound, but the sudden, almost holy quiet of still air. After days of screaming wind and battering snow, the hush inside the cave struck harder than any welcome. The heat was real, not the scorched burst of a fire built too fast, but a deep, even warmth that radiated from the earth itself, slow and sure. It touched their skin like a mother's hand. One man fell to his knees. Another began to sob. There were 13 who made it inside that first night. Elias came last, his coat stiff with ice, his beard split into frozen cords. He didn't speak, just nodded once at Thomas, then leaned heavily against the wall and shut his eyes. They brought with them nothing but what hadn't frozen: 3 rabbits, 2 ruined blankets, a half-empty tin of ground coffee, and a full scattering of gear hastily gathered before the worst of the storm. The cave was already crowded, but no one complained. Thomas motioned silently toward the far end where he'd stacked spare hides, extra bedrolls, and a small store of dry food. It was more than any of them had. They expected to stay 1 night, maybe 2, until the worst passed. But the storm had other plans. The blizzard howled for 7 more days. It was not a storm in the ordinary sense. This was no passing squall. It was a siege. The wind grew cunning, finding cracks in the frozen corners of lesser shelters and widening them like pry bars. Trees snapped not from weight, but from stress, twisted by gusts until their trunks burst. Snow drifted against slopes in waves, reshaping the very land. The men below who hadn't made the climb, 3 known to have stayed behind, were never seen again. Inside the shelter, something strange began to happen. In the earliest days, the cave had felt like a refuge, a mercy. But as the storm dragged on, and the depth of their predicament settled into the bones of every man present, the mood shifted. Not toward despair, though there was fear, yes, and tension, but toward a grudging reverence. They began to look at Thomas differently. The same man who'd been the butt of jokes, the target of backhanded jabs about dirt under fingernails and mole-man instincts, now moved through the shelter with quiet authority. Not because he imposed it, but because he didn't need to. Every breath they took without ice stinging their lungs, every hour they passed without the agony of frostbite spreading further, every warm cup of water and strip of preserved meat, they all came from Thomas's foresight. And the way he moved, efficient, calm, methodical, told them he'd prepared for this, not just a winter. This winter, Elias, who'd led men across ranges and through country most wouldn't brave with a company at their back, watched Thomas with the squint of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. "You built this with your hands?" he asked on the 4th day. Thomas nodded. "With the earth's help." That was the most he said for nearly a day. He wasn't silent out of secrecy, but purpose. Every act in the shelter had a reason, every beam reinforced, every layer of clay compacted in a specific sequence. The ceiling didn't drip, not even when the fires were fed high. Condensation formed on cold nights, yes, but Thomas had carved shallow grooves along the walls to guide the moisture into a drainage pit at the far end. The smoke, instead of choking them out, curled upward through the double-back chimney, and exited with barely a draft. Warmth held, heat was kept. By the 5th day, the men began adjusting. They rotated in sleep cycles, kept fires modest but steady, rationed supplies with discipline. Thomas had stored more than he ever let on: jerky, beans, root vegetables wrapped in cloth and buried near the wall to stay cool, but not freeze, salt and dried herbs, fat rendered into tallow, used to coat boots, oil hinges, and when pressed, to fry thin slices of root and meat into something resembling stew. One night, a young trapper named Isaiah, no more than 21, half-starved, and still reeling from the death of his older brother in the lower camp, finally broke the spell. He sat next to Thomas near the fire, staring at the coals. "Why?" he asked. "Why build like this? What made you know?" Thomas didn't look up. He stirred the pot gently, steam rising in the dim firelight. "I lived through a winter once," he said finally. "Not like this, maybe, but bad enough. We thought we had shelter. We didn't. The roof came down in January. Spent the next month sleeping under hides, burning green wood that choked us near to death. My brother lost both feet to frost. I lost half a year of my life trying to forget." Isaiah said nothing. Thomas continued. "Since then, I watched the way animals survive. Coyotes dig, bears sleep underground, even badgers know to get below the wind. But men, we think we're too clever for the dirt. We want height, vision, pride. Cold don't care about pride. It slips through the seams and gnaws the bones." The words hung in the air. No one dared respond. Outside, the storm surged again, but inside, the fire crackled and warmth held. As the days passed, the group changed. They learned to move quietly, to cook in shifts, to speak in murmurs that wouldn't carry through the vent hole and attract scavengers. They began reinforcing parts of the shelter. Thomas showed them how to pack earth against the doorframe so wind wouldn't catch it. He explained why he'd built the roof slope the way he had, to keep snow from piling too fast in one place, to make it slide off in controlled slabs. He even had poles ready to punch through the ceiling if collapse seemed imminent. Everything had been considered. It became clear that Thomas had prepared this shelter not just to survive, but to endure, for a season if need be, for multiple people. That realization struck Elias hardest. One night, long after most of the group had bedded down, he sat with Thomas near the fire and said quietly, You knew this storm was coming." Thomas shook his head. "Not this storm, but a storm. There's always one." And that, more than anything, stuck with them. That sentence echoed longer than the wind. There's always one. On the 8th day, the storm finally broke. It didn't end with fanfare. No bright sun burst through the clouds. The wind just slowed. The air stilled. Snow stopped falling. The silence outside became as deep as the one within. Elias stepped out first, pushing open the thick door that had frozen slightly into its frame. The sky was a dull, flat grey, and the drifts reached nearly to his chest, but the wind had died. That was enough. Over the next hours, the others emerged in pairs, blinking in the light, marveling at how the world had changed. Trees were buried to their lower branches. Campfires and cabins down in the valley, what was left of them, were now white mounds. The whole basin looked like a drowned world. But on the bluff, above the sweep of the frozen land, the cave still stood. Smoke drifted lazily from the vent. Inside, the warmth remained. They didn't all stay. Some returned to rebuild, to find what had survived. But others didn't leave. They stayed near Thomas, helped reinforce the cave, expand it. They brought stores up from abandoned cabins, added to the entrance wall, began shaping the hillside into something more than shelter, something permanent. They never called him a fool again. When the thaw came in March, long after the blizzard had passed and the basin had begun to cough up its dead, no one left the bluff. Men who had once planned to ride south to Fort Bridger or east toward the Missouri found themselves hesitating, then deciding to stay another week, then another month. Some justified it by saying there was still work to be done, that their cabins needed rebuilding or their horses recovering, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was simpler and harder to say aloud. The dirt cave had changed something fundamental. It had shifted their sense of what counted as wise, what counted as safe, and most of all, what counted as prepared. In the weeks that followed the storm, the bluff became something of a camp itself, not in the ramshackle sense of tents and scattered belongings, but as a living, breathing organism grown out of the earth. Elias and Thomas built a second dugout adjacent to the first, and when more trappers came through, men who'd heard about the warm hill from survivors or stumbled upon the place looking for food, they added a third, using the same principles Thomas had used that fall. The hillside, once bare, now bristled with small earth-covered structures, each one tucked low and sealed against the wind like a nest. They were careful not to cut into the integrity of the slope. Each new shelter was spaced, angled, reinforced. By late April, 7 men men were still living there full-time. Another 5 came and went, bringing news from the outside or trading dried meat, bullets, and tools. Word had spread fast. At Fort Laramie, they talked about a trapper who'd lived through the cold inside a bear den he'd built with his own hands. In Cheyenne Crossing, a freighter claimed he'd met a man who heated his shelter with dirt and smoke. It didn't take long for these stories to morph into something bigger, half-truths wrapped in awe, coated in legend. But the men on the bluff didn't correct them. They knew the truth, they'd lived it, and they were learning. What had started as necessity became experimentation. Thomas, ever silent but never idle, began trying new ideas. He built a draft tube that pulled in outside air low to the floor, creating a natural convection current that helped keep smoke moving upward without dragging heat with it. He buried flat stones beneath his sleeping platform and heated them each evening so they'd radiate warmth through the night. He even built a series of small clay urns, sealed vessels filled with sand and pebbles, that he placed around the fire pit to store and slowly release residual heat. Elias, though older and more set in his ways, became fascinated by the logic of it. He took notes, sketched diagrams in charcoal on the back of fur scraps, asked questions late into the evening. "You're not just building a shelter," he said one night, watching Thomas fit a log brace against the far wall. "You're building a system." Thomas didn't respond at first. Then, "It's not about comfort, it's about control." That word, control, lingered. Out here, in a land ruled by weather and wilderness, where no man truly commanded his fate, the idea of controlling anything, even just the heat in your home, felt revolutionary. By summer, the bluff had a name, Hollow Post, a joke at first from one of the younger trappers who stuck a hollowed-out log upright near the trailhead and called it their post office. But the name stuck. Travelers knew to leave messages there, scratched into bark, tied with twine, or pressed into soft clay. It became a waypoint, a rumor magnet, and eventually a destination. But not everyone welcomed what Hollow Post represented. In July, a company of trappers passed through on their way west to the Snake River. Led by a man named Rowley Finch, a lean, sharp-jawed veteran of the trade, they rode into the bluff with the arrogance of men who'd never known hunger or cold. Rowley took one look at the dugouts and snorted. "You lot living like gophers now?" he asked Elias, standing with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "What's next, chewing bark and sleeping in root balls?" Elias, now leaner from the winter but sharper than ever, didn't rise to the bait. "We lived," he said. "That's more than I can say for the Crow Creek boys." Rowley frowned. "Crow Creek? 10 men froze," Elias said flatly. 2 burned trying to stay warm." Rowley said nothing after that, but the encounter stirred old tensions. Some men couldn't abide the idea that dirt and silence and patience had saved more lives than rifles or bravado. Others feared what it meant, that the rules they'd relied on in the wild might be changing. If survival now hinged on thinking rather than toughness, then men like Thomas were dangerous, and dangerous men, even quiet ones, attract enemies. In August, someone tried to sabotage the bluff. It happened just past midnight, a faint flicker of light through the trees, then a spark. The slope above one of the newer dugouts had been soaked in pine oil and set alight. The fire caught fast, too fast for it to be an accident, but the fire never spread. Thomas had planned for that. Every roof was layered in sod, thick enough to smother embers. Drainage ditches circled the shelters like trenches. When flames licked the outer grass, the moisture below snuffed them. The fire burned hot, short, and out. They never found who did it, but the message was clear. Not everyone wanted Hollow Post to succeed. Still, it did. By autumn, Thomas had begun drafting new plans, rough sketches on bark and hide, showing a version of the shelter large enough to hold 15 men in separate chambers. He spoke rarely, but when he did, men listened. He talked of building low communities, settlements half below ground, designed to weather not just storms, but drought, raids, fire, a kind of frontier resilience that wasn't just reactionary, but intentional. "It's not about hiding," he said once. "It's about lasting." Elias watched him carefully during these conversations. He saw in Thomas a mind that ran deep as river channels, quiet on the surface, but powerful beneath. And he wondered how long they had before someone with authority, military, territorial, or corporate, came sniffing around, looking to claim, tax, or bury what Thomas had built. The first snow of the next winter came early again, but this time Hollow Post was ready. 7 shelters, a storehouse dug into the north wall, smoke holes reinforced with tin rings, clay tiles molded by hand to form a system of dampers that could be opened or closed depending on weather, a rotating watch schedule, cold cellars, heated benches. Every man carried knowledge now, lessons from the previous winter embedded in their hands like calluses, and yet it was the 3rd week of November when they faced their second trial. The blizzard wasn't as long as the first, but it came harder, a wall of ice that moved too fast to prepare for. A trapper from the upper trails stumbled into Hollow Post half dead, clothes shredded, hands blue to the wrists. He was carrying a message. A group of settlers, east of the river, cut off, no food, no fire, 6 adults, 3 children. They were 12 miles away. The bluff went silent. No one spoke. Then Thomas stood. He packed food, fat, coals in a clay jar, and 2 spare fur wraps. Without a word, 3 others joined him: Elias, Isaiah, and a man named Croft. They left before dawn, roped together, pushing into a storm most would never walk into. It wasn't about bravery, it was about obligation. They returned 2 days later. All 9 settlers survived. Thomas never spoke of what they saw out there, but Isaiah, when pressed, said only this: "It was a different kind of cold, a killing cold. If we'd come 6 hours later, they'd be gone." After that, no one questioned the cave again. No one questioned him. The rescue changed everything, not because it added new bodies to Hollowpost, though 3 of the settlers chose to stay through the rest of the winter, but because it rewrote the story. Before that, Thomas's cave was a curiosity, an eccentricity that happened to save lives. Afterward, it became proof that there was a better way to survive the West, that maybe this wilderness didn't have to be a constant gamble between luck and loss, that maybe planning, humility, and hard-won knowledge could do more than firepower or thick skins ever could. The settlers who arrived were in rough shape. One man had lost 3 toes. A woman had a lung infection that turned every breath into a wheeze. One of the children, a boy of about 9, wouldn't speak for days. But the warmth of the dugouts, the quiet steadiness of the routines, and the methodical calm of Thomas's leadership began to heal them, slowly then all at once, as spring crept over the ridgelines again. That winter didn't last as long as the one before, but in a way, it was harder. The cold was deeper, the storms shorter but crueler. The wind cut sideways like flint blades. Twice, drifts blocked the ventilation systems and had to be cleared at night to keep smoke from choking them out. Food ran lower than expected, and one night, Croft, the broad-shouldered ex-rancher who had gone on the rescue trip, didn't come back from a foraging run. They found him 2 days later, buried beneath a fallen pine, neck broken, face turned skyward, as if surprised that the world could kill him so quietly. Thomas didn't say a word at the burial, but he dug the grave himself, 6 feet down, through frozen clay and stone. Without asking for help, no one tried to stop him. After that, the tone of Hollowpost changed. It had always been reverent, men speaking low, working together without prompting, following unspoken rules. But now it became quiet, not fearful, not grim, but mature, as if the place itself had grown up. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a memory, a cemetery, a vow, and in that silence, new ideas took root. Thomas began carving notches into the wall of his original dugout, one for each day the shelter had kept them alive. When asked why, he said, "So I don't forget what time is, or what it's worth." Elias took it further. He began transcribing what they'd learned: methods, material types, soil behaviors, vent construction, layering strategies. At first, he used scraps of leather, birch bark, whatever he could find. Later, a traveling missionary passed through with parchment and offered him a stack in trade for food and shelter. Elias gave it gladly. What they created over the next month was more than notes. It was a manual, a living guide to survival, not based on stories or bravado, but on method. Test, observe, adjust, endure, and that's when others started arriving again. By mid-spring, Hollowpost became a pilgrimage site for mountain men and homesteaders who'd heard the stories, many of them ridiculous exaggerations. They came expecting to find a wizard in the hills, a lunatic genius with smoke pouring from underground tunnels and steam-powered stoves. What they found instead was a community of tired, smart, weather-scarred men and women, living inside warm dirt huts, with their feet dry and their beans hot. At first, most visitors stayed only a day or 2. They asked questions, took notes, offered trade. A few scoffed, some stayed, but word kept spreading, and eventually someone came who wanted to own what they found. Late that spring, a government agent arrived, one of the early surveyors working for the Office of Western Expansion. He wore polished boots and carried a notebook with embossed leather and gold leaf trim, said his name was Langston Weatherly, and that he was here to document settlement anomalies reported by trappers from Fort Pierre. He walked the bluff with the eye of a tacksman, measured shelters, sketched elevations, took soil samples, asked no questions, just watched. And when he finally spoke, it was in the voice of a man preparing to lay claim. "You do not possess legal ownership of this land," he said to Elias and Thomas one evening, standing by the smoke vent. "And these structures, while admirable, are not recognized as permanent dwellings under current frontier code. You will need to submit claims to the territorial office, at which point land surveys and taxation considerations will apply." Elias was silent. Thomas stared at the man for a long moment, then said, "And if we don't?" Langston smiled thinly. "Then eventually someone else will." That night, a meeting was held in the largest dugout. No fire, just lanterns, no raised voices, just talk. They discussed what it meant to stay, what it meant to fight, what it meant to lose everything they'd built to a system that didn't understand why it worked. Then Thomas said something none of them forgot. "We didn't build this place for comfort," he said. "We built it because it was the only thing that worked. We didn't ask for ownership. We earned it, one storm at a time. If a man wants to take that with a pen and a paper, let him try. But I'll be here, and so will the bluff." The next morning, Langston left. Quietly, he never returned, but men like him always do, eventually, so they prepared. Over the summer, they built more. Not just shelters, but defenses. Trenches around the bluff filled with stone and debris to slow any approach. Signals embedded in the landscape. Rock piles in coded shapes to warn travelers of danger or mark safe paths. They established storage caches a mile out in each direction, buried in waterproof hides, in case they had to flee or supply others. And they began teaching, not just visitors, but each other. Every man was trained in every skill: soil testing, beam setting, vent repair, thermal layering, insulation packing, emergency rationing. They held drills, ran night watches, turned survival into structure. They weren't preparing for war, they were preparing for the future. In the third fall, they built something new, a round chamber, 12 feet in diameter, dug deeper than the others, lined in clay and stone, a central fire pit, storage shelves carved directly into the wall. It was meant as a meeting place, a school, a place to pass down everything they'd learned. Thomas called it the Hold. When asked why, he said only, "Because if the blizzard comes again, this is where we hold." And then the blizzard did come again. Not that year, but the next. And it was worse, longer, colder, meaner. Snow began before Halloween and didn't let up until March. The winds howled like wolves drunk on blood. Entire herds vanished beneath drifts. Timber snapped in forests thought too thick to bend. A hunting party tried to make it from Laramie to Cheyenne and was found in April, frozen mid-step, packs still on their backs. Even the rivers froze in places they never had before. But Hollow Post held. They'd built deeper now, dug channels for runoff, reinforced every entrance with stone slabs and sod layers 3 feet thick. They'd stocked supplies over the summer like ants before the flood. Each chamber was independent but connected by narrow crawl tunnels, insulated with canvas and pine pitch. Fires burned low and long, feeding heat into clay vessels and buried stones that radiated for days. No one froze, no one starved, not one man lost a finger, not one child cried from cold. In February, when the storm was at its worst, a group of 4 men arrived, barely alive, riding half-dead ponies. They had no fire, no food. 2 had frostbite on their faces. 1 was blind from snow glare. They'd followed cairns marked with Thomas's system, small stone towers spaced at intervals with notches to show direction, a trail of salvation written in rock. When they stumbled into Hollow Post, they didn't ask for shelter, they just wept. And Thomas, who had once been the man others laughed at for digging into the dirt, wrapped them in furs, fed them hot broth, and said, "You're safe. The storm can't touch you now." Because it couldn't, not anymore. By the time spring arrived after the third great blizzard, Hollow Post was no longer a secret. It was a legend. What had begun as one man's act of desperation, digging into the cold earth to escape the teeth of winter, had become a way of life. It had grown beyond a shelter, beyond a survival trick, into a symbol of something frontier folk rarely spoke about: forethought, not courage, not toughness, not brute endurance, but the quiet, deliberate art of preparing for what others refused to believe could happen. The story of that last winter spread in every direction, carried on the backs of fur traders, missionaries, ranch hands, and scouts. From Montana to Missouri, from Fort Bridger to Bent's Fort, men spoke of a high bluff where fires still burned when every valley froze, where men and women walked barefoot inside their dugouts, while others outside wrapped in furs and still couldn't sleep for the cold. They told tales of Thomas Zachary, the cave builder, the one who had seen the storm coming before anyone else even smelled the wind change. Some versions of the story grew outlandish, that he had slept with bears to learn their ways, that he could smell snow days before it came, that he had dug so deep into the bluff he struck geothermal heat and now lived above a natural furnace. But the truth, as it often is, was simpler and more remarkable. He had learned, he had applied, he had endured. In the spring thaw, when the rivers ran fat with meltwater and elk calves wobbled on newborn legs, A decision was made. Not by vote, not by declaration, but by shared breath around the fire. Hollow Post would remain. It would not be abandoned like the seasonal camps of trappers past. It would not be left behind for the next wagon train or the next shallow dream of gold. It would grow. That summer, they built the first true structure above the earth, not because they needed it for shelter, but because the time had come to mark the place, not just survive, but signal to the world that this bluff, this hollow in the dirt, was not temporary. It was a roundhouse, low, broad and fortified, with walls made from interlocked sod blocks, reinforced with wooden framing. A skylight built from scrap glass traded from the fort was embedded into the roofline. Inside, the center fire burned in a pit lined with stone and clay, its heat drawn up through a chimney Thomas had designed with adjustable flues to control draft and smoke. Around the interior wall, shelves were carved, half for supplies, half for scrolls, bark sheets, and scraps of hide covered in writings. The roundhouse wasn't a church. It wasn't a town hall. It wasn't even a lodge. It was something older, a hearth, in the truest sense of the word, a place where knowledge lived, a fire that held not just warmth, but memory. They called it the archive, and the first thing written on its door was not a date or a name. It was a sentence, built for the storm no one sees coming. That summer, 35 people lived on the bluff. Men, women, children, hunters, former soldiers, widows, mixed families, and even a former slave who'd escaped east of the mountains and been led to Hollow Post by a Shawnee guide who remembered the smoke trails above the ridge. No one was turned away, but everyone learned. You didn't stay at Hollow Post unless you pulled your weight. You didn't burn more than your share. You didn't waste heat. You didn't mock the dirt, the silence, the crawl spaces, or the systems that kept them alive. You learned the trench layout. You practiced digging. You knew how to patch a leak, reseal a vent, store dry moss for insulation, or recognize frostbite before it took flesh. The bluff was now more than a shelter. It was a culture. In the fall of 1843, 4 years after Thomas first climbed the slope and vanished into the hillside, an eastern newspaper published a letter. It had been dictated by Elias to a traveling reporter who stayed for 3 nights and wept when he left. The letter was titled A Society of Earth and Fire, and it described Hollow Post not as a frontier curiosity, but as a model for what Western life could be. It read, in part, "These are not men hiding from the world, but those who have finally understood it. They do not fight the cold, they outlast it. They do not waste time building what can be seen, they build what survives. And they are not fools crouched in dirt. They are builders of a knowledge that will one day seem like prophecy." That line echoed east. It showed up in speeches, in sermons, even in a debate about how to handle frontier infrastructure. But out at Hollow Post, none of that mattered. Thomas never saw the article. He had grown quieter in the last year, as if the cave had taken something from him and given something else in return. He still worked, still walked the ridge each morning to check for signs of erosion, flood, or tracks. He still repaired the seals on the smoke holes and taught every child who stayed past one season how to build a cold trap channel in the floor of a shelter. But his eyes were always scanning the horizon now, as if looking for something only he could sense. And one day, without warning, he left. No horse, no note, no trail, just gone. The only sign he'd prepared was a new tunnel he'd finished 2 weeks before, dug northward at a sharp angle, reinforced meticulously, ending in a dry alcove with 2 shelves, 4 packs of supplies, and a clay pot with a bundle of sage, a flint striker, and a folded scrap of hide that read, "For the next one." Some believed he died out there, somewhere in the high country. Others believed he went deeper, further west, to build something bigger. A few claimed to have seen him near the Bighorns, trading for salt and beans with a Shoshone party, his eyes still scanning the weather. Elias never said what he believed, but each year, on the day the first frost touched the grass, he lit the fire in the archive and carved a new notch into the wall beside Thomas's name. They never elected a leader at Hollow Post. They didn't need to. The bluff itself was the law. The systems were the guides. The knowledge kept them safe. And in time, others copied it. Dugouts began appearing along the rivers, near passes, in the shadows of hills where timber was scarce. Some were crude imitations. Others were built by former residents who carried the lessons with them. And over the years, when the next storms came, and they always came, those with the earth above their heads and the fire low in their walls fared better than those who mocked the dirt. What began as laughter turned into envy, then imitation, then reverence, but none of it would have happened if not for a single man with calloused hands and a vision that reached deeper than frost could dig. A man who remembered what it felt like to watch a fire die while cold crept up your legs. A man who knew, more than anything else, that survival was not about strength, it was about design. So when the old trappers, told the tale around fires. They didn't call him Thomas the Builder, or Thomas the Survivor, or even Thomas the Wise. They called him the man who outdug winter. And the story always ended the same way. Everyone laughed at his dirt cave shelter, until it was the only warm place left in the blizzard, and by then, it was too late to dig their own.